are mini PCs worth it? I don't know about you, but I've always thought of mini PCs as cheap options, at least on the Windows side. Of course, you have the Mac Mini as well, which has actually been quite good since the M1 chip and now the M2 model. But this here is a Windows mini PC, and it's a pretty darn impressive one, right around the same price as you would pay for a Mac Mini. We'll be talking both about the Mac Mini and cheaper mini PCs a bit, but we'll be mostly focusing on the viability of something like this in day-to-day usage as well as when it comes to gaming. There's many reasons why one might want a mini PC rather than a full-fledged tower, be it purely because of a lack of space on your desk or just because you prefer the smaller form factor. A laptop might seem like a better solution, but for equivalent specs, you'll be jumping up in money by a significant margin. So if you're willing to deal with always being plugged into both a monitor and a wall, but all in a compact form factor, a mini PC like this one might just be the way to go. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. This here specifically is an awesome little machine sent to me by Minisforum, a company that makes a bunch of compact PCs with some impressive hardware. This one in particular is the UM690 and has absolutely top of the line internals. We're talking an AMD Ryzen 9 6900HX, 16 gigs of RAM, a 512 gig SSD. It's simple, small, practical, and it comes at a price point that won't leave you without both of your kidneys. This video is not sponsored, but if you're curious about this PC, you'll find a link to the webpage for it in the description. I don't make any money if you click it, I'm not affiliated at all, but big thanks to Minisforum for sending this to me to review because it is a sweet little PC. I've been wanting to set up a storage server or something for myself, so I might use it for that, but either way, I've been pretty impressed with how much power this little thing is able to pump out. If you want to get the same specs that I have here, specifically with the UM690, you're looking at what is currently a bit under $700 US, and then the base model with the same CPU is $520 as of recording this. They've also got the older Ryzen generation CPUs that will cost a little bit less. Mini PCs have been popular for years, and they've always hovered in a strange area between decent value and then giving up function for form. With limited size comes a limited capability, but also often a limited price tag. So as said, we are talking about mini PCs as a whole, but we're going to have a particular emphasis on what can be considered the high end of mid-range. Something like a UM690 from somewhere between $500 to $700. The Mac Mini is another great option, and it fits right dap in the middle at $600. That's US dollars with Apple's insanely powerful M2 processor, but it's also lacking in a few key areas with only 8 gigs of RAM and a pretty paltry 256 gigs of storage. That was really bad in 2020 when the M1 model came out. It's much worse today. 8 gigs of RAM is also not too great, but if you want to upgrade these things, you're adding on hundreds and hundreds of dollars to the point where you might as well even go to the next step up with the M2 Pro chip. But of course, then you're paying $1,300, and that's with 512 gigs of storage. A big issue with Macs in general, but the Mac Mini, is that once you buy, say, the 256 gig model, you're stuck with it. You're missing the sort of upgradability featured in a lot of Windows-based mini PCs like this one. Opening up the computer is easy. You have to take these little rubber pads off the bottom and then unscrew things, and then upgrading is even easier. Not only is the DDR5 RAM right there with 2 extra slots, letting you bring things up to 64 gigs if you'd like to, but they somehow also had room to include an expansion bay for even a full-on 2.5-inch drive, like an extra SSD, which is super cool. This thing is meant to last and be as customizable as you want it to be. Comparing it to a Mac Mini is a fruitless endeavor. Get it? Fruitless? Well, they're two completely different machines with what I would say are completely different markets. Mainly it's best for those who want a Mac in the first place. The Mac Mini has a sleeker, nicer design with solid feeling aluminum. The Minisforum PC in contrast isn't ugly by any means, but the casing is plastic and it both looks and feels significantly cheaper than Apple's own options. But that's typical going from Windows to a Mac. You're absolutely going to be paying for Apple's design, and frankly, plastic is much more practical for a mini PC like this, even if it's not too premium. The power supply is actually built into the Mac Mini, and it's not on the Minisforum PC, which is a bit of a pity. Again, the Mac Mini is just more premium, but there are benefits of not having the PSU inside the case, such as the expansion bay. It's lighter, it has a smaller footprint, and there's way more ports, including a good few on the front. The Mac Mini is always a pain in that regard. But best of all, as said, it's easy to open up and work on, something very taboo when it comes to Apple products. If you do want a Mac Mini, I highly recommend going cheap and buying external storage to connect via Thunderbolt. I say cheap because, in my opinion, the amount of money you have to pay to go up in specs is just absurd, and most people buying a Mac Mini just need it for the basics anyways, which it'll do great for. The processor in there is very powerful. You could also look at Apple's certified refurbished section. That's how I got my M1 Mac Mini, and if you see the M1 model on there, it's worth mentioning it's very solid. I'd say it might be worth saving a couple $100 for. By the way, whatever you do, do not buy an Intel Mac Mini. they might just be the worst value Apple has to offer. It's awful, get an M1 or an M2. But that's enough of the Mac Mini, because again, we want to focus on the more overall landscape for Windows Mini PCs. It's so much different than it used to be, where for years, Mini PCs garnered a reputation of being cheap and unreliable, usually because they were. People would buy a Mini PC for $200 and then be disappointed when it was already slow a year or two later, if it even took that long. You get what you pay for, and that's what makes the upper range options so intriguing. Even Minisforum's cheaper options integrate relatively recent CPUs. Nothing like those sellers that refurbish old computers and stuff 10-year-old i5 chipsets into a small case, put an SSD in and DDR3 RAM, and then call it a day. Those PCs are always worth avoiding. They might look good, but what they're not telling you is the base hardware is probably like 10 years old. Now with that in mind, it's not as if there aren't good, cheap Mini PCs. They've become a lot more common now, as especially with Ryzen chipsets, you just get a lot more value than you used to. So it's something to keep an eye on. A slightly older Ryzen chipset might be worth it, along with 8 gigs of RAM and an NVMe SSD. A computer like that will be absolutely able to handle the basics for practically anybody. Web browsing, video streaming, you name it. This is a more general overview, so I'm not really giving a lot of specifics, and that's in part because when it comes to the Windows market, there's just so much variety out there, it's really difficult to, at least without focusing on one PC in particular, which we will now do as we move into the UM690. We've talked about the Mac Mini, we've talked about the lower end Mini PC market. The UM690 for us is going to kind of represent the higher mid-range, right around that Mac Mini price point, but on the Windows side. This is an impressive Mini PC, and an absolute beast when it comes to the specs. The Ryzen 9 6900HX is a high-end laptop CPU, and that's right, a laptop chipset. When you're dealing with something this small, there's not a lot of space, especially when you need to take into account not only the form factor, but limited power draw, thermals, and all of that. And so we end up with a very high-end laptop CPU. This Ryzen 9 is killer, and the big reason you should probably go Ryzen with any sort of Mini PC is because Mini PCs generally aren't going to have a graphics card. Ryzen chipsets have pretty good integrated graphics. They've had them for a while, and the 6900HX is no exception. We've got the AMD Radeon 680M, comparable to a GTX 1050 Ti, and it's about as good as you're going to get without going to an actual video card. Now that is something you can do with this Mini PC. Obviously one wouldn't fit in there, but you can get one of those docking station things for a graphics card and plug it into the USB 4 port in the front, and this is something you can do with other laptops and even the Mac Mini. It's pretty cool, but also massively impractical. Unless you've already got one of those, you might as well just build a new PC that can actually fit a graphics card, not pay the hundreds of dollars required to get one set up on your miniature PC. That being said, what I like about this Mini PC is that it's capable of not only pretty stellar performance in most workloads, but it actually can game to a limited extent. Less recent games, such as Portal 2 here, run flawlessly on it. I mean, it's no problem. Of course, Portal 2 is a pretty old game at this point, but it's still really fun, and a lot of games like this are going to run on here with zero issue whatsoever. Then you got something like Spider-Man for PC. This is a more intensive game, and it actually crashed on me when I tried running it at ultra settings just to see what would happen. I didn't even get through the entire opening cutscene before it failed. Weirdly enough, we were approaching 30 FPS though, even with ultra settings. This is 1080p, and when I turned things down to medium, which was the recommended, we weren't actually doing a whole lot better. Still pretty close to that 30 frames per second mark, which is playable, but not ideal. I would like to get to 60 if possible. At least we weren't crashing and we couldn't actually play. I did try lowering the graphics to low, just all the lowest settings possible, and even then we were looking at like under 40 frames per second, so that was a bit odd. That's probably fixable somehow. You should get much better gains from lowering the settings so drastically. Note on the top there, it does say 0 RPM. That's, at first I thought that was the CPU fan, and I was like, wow, but then I realized I could hear the fan pretty clearly. It was trying to show the GPU fan, except that the GPU is integrated, and there is no fan for the GPU. So anyway, I got rid of that eventually once I realized what was going on. I also tried out Cyberpunk 2077, a game known for its high-end graphics. Now I lost the initial footage I took, unfortunately. It was pretty great because I immediately crashed into a wall, got out of my car, and was stuck inside of said wall. I could not get out and had to reload. So this footage here, I think it's between low and medium settings, mostly low, and we're not quite hitting 30 FPS consistently driving through the city. The game itself actually, I think, looks quite good, but we would want to kind of get up to that 30 frames per second mark at minimum. So I messed with the settings a bit and turned on AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution. It actually technically was turned on already, but it was on auto and it clearly wasn't doing its job, so turning it to ultra performance kicked it into gear, and that right there pretty much fixed everything. It looks a lot worse, but if you capped it at 30 frames per second, it'd be better off. I also tried Elden Ring. I tried it on the default settings first, which was high actually, and I was getting an easy 30 frames per second, 30 to 40, and again, I went to kind of low settings to try to push things to 60 frames per second, and we weren't quite making that, so I would definitely rather play at 30 frames per second and have it look quite a bit crispier then have a very inconsistent 40 to 55 or whatever. These games can always be optimized better to get the full potential out of your computer, but I was pretty happy with how well it was doing. Then there's Halo Infinite. I played an entire match of Halo Infinite. Performance-wise was actually quite impressive. Even on medium-high settings, it was very playable, and it was also fun to mess with a guy who was super duper salty in chat for some reason. It's quick play, go unranked if you want to be mad, bro. Also, I'm really funny. So that's about it for the highlights of games I played. I mean, I did play Stardew as well. Yeah, you can run Stardew on this thing, just like a potato. A potato could run Stardew Valley, and so can the UM690. I honestly don't know what else to talk about here. The specs are solid, and I could get technical with the specifications and the numbers, but I just don't think it matters that much to most people. The point that I'm trying to make is around $600, $700. Going with something like the Minisforum UM690 is pretty decent value. Could you build your own PC for the same amount of money that would be better? I'm sure you could, but it's not going to be this small. It's not going to be this convenient. It's not going to come preloaded with Windows with absolutely no bloat. It's not going to be as power efficient. This is a good value mini PC, and if you're someone who wants a miniature PC, I do highly recommend it. Again, not sponsored, but link is in the description. It really comes down to you as an individual, what you want, and if you have limited desk space, it's not going to get much better than the UM690. So with that, I think we're right about done here. Not my most in-depth video ever, but I hope you enjoyed it. Big thanks to Minisforum for sending me this PC, and if you guys want to see anything else similar in the future, let me know. With that all being said, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Maybe hit that like button if this video helped you out or you found it interesting. And yeah, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.